Good morning, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Let me welcome you all to today's conference on the transformative power of economic democracy. My name is László Andor. I'm the Secretary General of FEPS, the Foundation for European Progressive Studies. And for those colleagues who might be connecting with FEPS first time, I would like to say that we are a political foundation. We belong to the social democratic political family in the European Union. We connect with many members, foundations, think tanks in all different European countries, but also beyond. We conduct a large amount of research. We produce publications. You have a sample of our publications at the entrance, so if it's not completely run out or run down, you still can pick up some copies. Maybe we can replenish in the lunch break if everything is gone by that time. Among many topics, we work on the questions of economy and finance from a progressive perspective, and from this point of view, this is an absolute delight that today, with all of you together, and even more in the afternoon, we can discuss economic democracy as a very important concept. We hugely appreciate the partnership with Open Society Foundation, and we teamed up on several issues in the past, but this is in a way a kind of pioneering project, and we really look forward to make this cooperation as productive as possible. When I say productive, I also want to imply that we are in a very interesting stage in the establishment of the new European leadership. This week and shortly in Strasbourg, the new European Parliament comes to existence, and then in the autumn period, the new European Commission will come to existence. And this is exactly the time when we believe that new ideas, new concepts would need to be proposed as clearly as possible, because it's not only about personnel. Most of the discussions and speculations revolve around the personnel, who is going to fill this position, this commissioner, committee chairs, all the rest of it. But what these people will do in their offices is important. What these people will promote or oppose in their high offices matters a lot for us. And then, in order to see some positive change in the coming period, of course, these ideas need to be put forward. So this is not the last event of FEPS through which we would like to discuss the new policy agenda, where concrete proposals can be made, and then the concrete proposals can be made after the analysis and after the stock taking. Indeed, this is going to take place on the presentation, after the presentation of the very important policy study on building economic democracy, which is going to be the first session. And then we build the program of the day in order to address specific aspects, dimensions of what we mean by the connection between economy and democracy. It will be about the workplace, where everything begins, but also the public household, as well as public services. I'm also grateful to the European Economic and Social Committee, which provides the venue for our discussion today. And in the afternoon session, we will also welcome the President of the European Economic and Social Committee, Mr. Oliver Röpke. Before handing over the microphone, let me just make one additional point, that in my view, we probably missed a few rounds to reform and improve the European business model. It goes back to the previous great crisis, what we call the great financial crisis, when I think it was very obvious that the European business model is not really sustainable. It does not deliver what the citizens really would like to see and receive as outcomes. But a lot of talk went into whether the European social model is sustainable or not, instead of ensuring that the economic model of the European Union is repaired. And of course, this question reaches out to questions of finance and many other aspects of the economy. And it's not a surprise that after failing to reform the economic system, you have more and more discontent coming up in the European elections, but also in the national elections, when it becomes obvious that a lot of people resent the growing inequality, the territorial imbalances, the very uneven opportunities which continue to prevail despite some countervailing mechanisms in the European Union, like cohesion policy, but in the recent years, territorial as well as income inequalities continue to grow, and we need to address this problem one way or another. So I hope that we will discuss very important cases today where we can, which we can learn from, and help transferring this very important knowledge to the policy agenda of the European Union, which is the crucial task of our foundation. With this, I hand over to Karim to continue the introduction.
Thank you, László. Thank you, Anna, also for inviting me. Karim Harris, Open Society Foundations. I'm the program manager responsible for climate and economic justice. This project is very close to our hearts. It is very much part of our vision and goals as we, as a foundation, look towards the future. For those who don't know, we are Open Society Foundations. We are the largest funder of human rights groups, democratic governance groups, independent groups working in closed and open societies to bring about a better world. We distribute over $32 billion in a series of thousands of projects over 120 countries globally. We set out with this project asking ourselves certain questions, and questions which are at the heart of our democracy. And as Open Society Foundation, we are, as well as society, going through our own internal transformation. What does it look like to be political philanthropy in a world which is climate constrained, in a world filled with inequality, in a world where the external politics do not support progressive ideas? How do we move forward? What is the pathway? Is there a blueprint? These are the questions that we are asking ourselves internally as we form our new programs, not only in this year of great eruptions, not just the European elections, but throughout the globe. We are experiencing shifts in political movements which affect the very values which we believe in. And I assume that we're all gathered here because these are all the things that we work on and believe in ourselves. So I'm really pleased that FEPS is joining us on this journey and asking these questions and trying to answer them, trying to figure out the pathway forward, a theory of change perhaps on how we gather our values together, how do we gather ourselves together in the beliefs that we have, and how do we then transfer that into the societies that we want. And I'm grateful also to the researchers and this report in helping us answer some of the questions. And I think the case studies that we will go through today are essential towards that. We won't come up with all the answers. That's not the point of today. But can we continue the dialogue? Can we perhaps come up with ideas and pathways forward? This will be our challenge today and going forward throughout this year, as László said, as the Commission and the Parliament is formed, but also, the global shifts, and that is a key concern for Open Society Foundation, not just what's happening in Europe, but how does Europe interact with its third country partners. We have internally as a foundation done a major shift towards our focus to the Global South and how Europe can be a supportive partner in bringing about open societies in the countries where we are active, where we are influencing. And of course, climate change is my background, so also where we are intervening as Europe in seeking our net zero goals. How are we impacting those around us? What are the net consequences? What are the positive and externalities, but also the negative externalities? And how can we, as Europe, shore up enough support to ensure that we have the partnerships that we need going forward, but also how do we build the world that we want? Open, free, dignity, respectful, everyone living in fair, open societies. So that's the challenge that we have this year and for many years going forward. And we, as Open Society, are committed to continuing that involvement in Europe and in the world in funding groups and also funding organizations and think tanks and academia who are seeking also to find these answers and to bring about the changes that we want. So I'm really pleased that this room is so full, and I think throughout the day we have many people joining us who are interested in this topic as well and interested in bringing about the changes that we all care about. Thank you.
Commentators for the first panel. Good. So we move into our presentation part of the study. So my name is Kolesnichenko. I'm economic policy analyst at FEPS, and I was coordinating this project. Yes, I will moderate this panel with a team of researchers here and also two commentators whom we invited. I will briefly introduce the researchers, the presenters. It's Andrew Cumbers, right to me, who is the main brain of this paper. He is a professor of political economy at the University of Glasgow and visiting professor at the University of Bonn. And in his work, he focuses on economic democracy, public ownership, and alternative economic strategies. He leads also EESC-funded project, Global Remunicipalization and the Post-Neoliberal Turn, and has received funding from the European Commission. He was editor of Urban Studies and serves on boards of various journals, and he has books. One is Reclaiming Public Ownership, winner of the 2015 Myrdal Prize, and another book is Case for Economic Democracy. Next to him is Karim Bilsland, who is a lecturer in organizational behavior at the University of Glasgow. So all three of them work in the same university, so it's a long-established team. And Karin focuses in her research broadly on work organization, employee engagement and participation, speciality and architecture in organizations. She published in many international peer-reviewed journals, such as New Technology, Work and Employment, and others. Next to her is Thomas Marois. Robert McMaster. Sorry, I just had the order wrong here. who is a professor of political economy in the Adam Smith Business School at the University of Glasgow. He was a senior lecturer in economics at the University of Aberdeen also. He has published numerous articles in international journals, co-authored 2 books, and co-edited 2 books. He is co-investigator on teams that received the Making a Difference Prize in the 2020 Scottish Knowledge Exchange Awards. He's a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. Then next is Thomas Marois, who is Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Public Banking. So we're actually lucky to have him here today because he is normally in Canada. But now today he is with us, and he is a professor of political economy and director of the Public Banking Project in McMaster University in Canada. He is the author of the award-winning 2021 book, Public Banks, Decarbonization, Definancialization, and Democratization. So he's more expert on public banking, but also in general on the democracy in general. And Martin O'Neill, who is professor of political philosophy at the University of York. He is a co-editor of the Property Owning Democracy, Roles and Beyond and Taxation. He is also the co-author of the Case for Community Wellbeing and a member of the trustee board of the Democracy Collaborative, which is a think and do tank based in Washington, D.C., which works on models for the democratic economy. And we actually will have a case later today which explores exactly what it means. So without further ado, I offer the floor to our researchers to present the paper, the study, which is available everywhere. You can take a copy. Please.
Thank you very much, Anna. And first of all, a big thanks to everybody for coming along today. Thanks to the Foundation for European Progressive Studies and Open Society for funding this research and holding this event. And it's great to see, as someone's already said, a full room to talk about economic democracy, which we clearly think is an important thing that should be on the agenda. I think our concern today is really with how we develop and strengthen economic democracy in a European context in particular. We, that's the research team in particular, but I think many people in this room, are strongly of the view that many of the crises that Europe's faced, whether it's the climate catastrophe, whether it's global inequalities, how those are played out in Europe, or whether it's the threat to democracy itself, or a certain form of democracy that we have at the moment with the advances towards authoritarianism and xenophobia in kind of mainstream politics. We're of the view that a lot of these crises can in large part be tackled with a policy agenda that takes economic democracy seriously. Now, as already been mentioned, there is a report that we've produced here, so I'd encourage everybody to read that and engage with that in terms of the agenda today that's now available. And this goes into the issues in a much greater detail and depth than we can possibly do with the time we have available today. But one of the key themes that I would really emphasize here in our work around economic democracy is how we're trying to build out from an older view of economic democracy, which is focused upon the workplace, collective bargaining, trade unions, and so on. We still find that as very, very important. But our project really is to think about how we seriously democratize the economy in its entirety. And this is really a key to our thinking. So in the brief time we've got available today, I think there's 3 parts to what we want to say. First, Bob is going to outline our thinking on this broader approach to economic democracy, around democratizing the economy as a whole, and the key elements that add up to that in developing a more holistic agenda for economic democracy that we think is critical to be applied across a range of policy areas. In the second part then, in our presentation, Karen and I are going to dig down into some of the case studies of this broader conception of economic democracy that we've been looking at as part of this project. And then finally, in the third part, sort of summing up some of these broader issues, I will reflect more critically, perhaps, on some of the positives, but also the constraints to developing this agenda around economic democracy in the years ahead. So, without further ado, I'll hand over to Bob.
Thanks very much, Andy. It's a great pleasure to be here. And it's just so refreshing, as Andy says, to see so many people that are interested in this. This, for us, is a very important topic. As Andy said, our principal aim is to try and broaden and deepen the conception of economic democracy. And of course, we're somewhat provocative in the in the title of this particular section, building away from the workplace. And I think that emphasises the depth to which and breadth to which we seek. We're not alone in doing this. We recognise that, and I'd like to applaud many people who are contributing in this area. Some of whom are here today. That I'm privileged to share the platform with today. I think there's two aspects I'd like to emphasise in terms of the conceptualisation of economic democracy as we understand it. And the first one I think is perhaps underemphasised in the literature, at least as we understand economic democracy, and that is the overwhelming moral imperative that's associated with economic democracy. And I don't think we can sufficiently emphasise this. It's an overwhelming moral imperative. And it stems from this notion of people are entitled to dignity and a fulfilling life. It's a rather Aristotelian notion about a flourishing and meaningful life. And what are the ways that we can achieve this? Now, in terms of this notion of a meaningful life, that implies that immediately we're rejecting the moral equivalence of people and machines, people and capital, that is really at the foundation of our economic system, the substitutability of labour without the sufficient say of labour, for example, in how they're directed, how their productive efforts are directed. So that would be a conceptual point. Also associated with this is the notions of justice. And of course, justice is incredibly complex. We draw upon the work of the political philosopher Nancy Fraser, who has a three-domain approach to justice, notions of justice. So she talks about an economic domain where we talk about redistributive justice, equality of wealth and income, and such like. And she also talks about a cultural domain where people have dignity, respect, they're free from discrimination, for instance. But reliant on that, and a prerequisite to those domains, is fair representation. And I think that's where economic democracy features, this notion of fair representation. And that, of course, speaks to capabilities, about the notion of being able to do and be what an individual can be, and how institutions can facilitate this notion. We also allude to a feminist approach within this, in that previous conceptions, at least as we understand them, of economic democracy tend to be conflated with industrial democracy and the marginalisation of minorities and females. So in terms of an important contribution to the deepening and broadening of economic democracy, we feel that feminist thought has much to do. And that invites considerations, for example, of care relationships and so forth, which are vital to social reproduction and the reproduction of economic activity. So we believe that there is a compelling moral narrative associated with economic democracy, and we emphasise the importance of this. Coupled to this, I believe there's a legal and institutional dimension. The legal system is vitally important in terms of ensuring individual rights. So there is a top-down element and dimension to this, in that without the suitable legal framework, many of the initiatives, democratic initiatives, would be stymied at best. So we allude to literatures and contributions in this in terms of the works of, varied works of John Dewey, the philosopher, Robert Dahl, David Ellerman, Nancy Fraser again. about how the prioritisation of individual rights, especially in the workplace, the prioritisation of individual rights over capital is vitally important to this. And of course, added to this is important work around ownership forms and transparency, deliberative discussion, discourse within economic decision-making. Can you press the clicker, please, Karen? And that forms the three pillars of our approach. So we talk about individual economic rights. We allude to various examples of this in the report. So going a bit off-piste, we talk about the possibilities of universal basic income, universal basic services, important discussions and debates around that, about employment rights, the right to employment, the state as the employer of last resort. And there's considerable literatures in this. This couples with the capabilities approach associated with the likes of Amartya Sen, Martha Nussbaum, about facilitating choice, about enabling people to live a full and flourishing life. And again, associated with this is the second pillar. Well, whilst these pillars may be seen as separable, they do overlap conceptually. There's diverse ownership forms, the importance of plurality in our economic structures, moving away from the kind of Anglo-American extractive model of production, which is founded on maximisation of shareholder value, for instance. And finally, I think the pillar about transparency, about collective deliberation, that invites considerations of education as well. If I recall, John Stuart Mill spoke about this way back in the 19th century. We don't really touch, there are parameters about how much we can do. We don't really touch about the importance of education, but nonetheless, I think that might have some bearing on where we go. But nonetheless, I think some of the illustrative cases that Andy and Karen will allude to will demonstrate the application of these three pillars, I hope. If I move on,
yes,
thank you very much.
Okay, so hi everyone. So turning now to consider some examples then based on our selected cases. So we explore the current landscape of economic democracy across Europe. We've identified cases and examples of good practice, while also identifying obstacles and constraints to more systemic transformational change. So in our policy study, we explore some effective strategies and best practices, so highlighting what has proven to work well in fostering economic democracy and identifying successful frameworks and approaches that have yielded more positive outcomes. We also look at public engagement and participation, so examining methods for effectively involving publics in economic decision-making processes, understanding the role of grassroots mobilisations, public referenda and community-led initiatives, and discovering how diverse groups such as activists, NGOs and social movements collaborate to drive change. So by analysing these aspects, we aim to provide a more sort of comprehensive understanding of how European cases can inform and inspire economic democracy initiatives globally. So our research highlights some of the key drivers behind successful and sustained forms of economic democracy at the local level. So we decided to focus on three key spheres, and one of these centred around efforts to try and democratise local economic spending. And while time here prevents a more forensic account of each of our cases, I'll just take a couple of cases that we've looked at by example. And you'll find each of the cases explored in more detail in our policy study that Andy referred to. So as part of our study, we looked at participatory budgeting. Sorry, I've skipped a slide here. Participatory budgeting in German towns and cities, so Eberswald in Brandenburg, UK Citizens Economic Council, and I'll come to community wealth building and the Preston model. So In Preston, England, we have this example is taken from the UK. We have the Community Wealth Building Initiative, which aimed at retaining wealth locally. And this is achieved through leveraging the procurement practices of public anchor institutions, such as hospitals, local government and public universities. So using these to create local economic multiplier effects. And this approach has established local supply chains and led to the founding and support of 10 cooperatives. And a key element of the community wealth building model, as an example, just to take one, is expanding cooperatives and employee ownership, as well as creating local public and cooperative banking institutions and vehicles to finance and sustain and grow more local forms of collective ownership. But this has not been without its challenges, and the initiative faces resistance from some political factions invested in traditional business governance, and additionally ongoing pressures on local authority. Budgets constrain the capacity to expand the initiative further. But despite these challenges, the programme demonstrates significant strides in fostering local economic resilience. Moving on to consider our second element, so learning about democratising the workplace, and the 5 cases we explored are listed there. So economic democracy at the local workplace level, we all know, is a core theme of traditional approaches, but it remains significant to our vision of both extending individual economic rights and creating more collective and democratically controlled forms of economy. And we found some good examples of good practices in all of these cases listed there. And participation is, we would emphasise, a key aspect here. So the John Lewis Partnership is a prominent example of employee ownership in the UK, where staff members are partners in the business. They share in profits and decision making. Mondragon, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, and these are the other cases that we explored, but let's just focus on John Lewis by example. So in the UK, the John Lewis Partnership really exemplifies success in employee ownership, with democratic procedures ensuring that employees share in the company's success. And this alternative model really does represent a departure from the prevailing traditional hierarchical ownership structure in the UK, embodying more democratic and participatory principles. So John Lewis is a retailer, for those of you that are not familiar with the organisation, selling homeware, fashion, tech, also Waitrose, which is a supermarket as part of that sells food. The company has quite an interesting history. So over 100 years ago, the founder, John Sperrin Lewis, began an experiment to improve business practices by involving staff in decision-making processes. So quite a radical step at the time. He established principles for the company's operations, created a written constitution to clarify the rights and responsibilities of partners as co-owners of the business, and aimed to create a business model that was both commercially agile and democratic, giving every partner a voice. And this forward-thinking approach is what has defined the company, John Lewis, for the last century. However, the company has faced some significant challenges recently, partly due to inflation, a contraction in demand from the COVID-19 pandemic, and of course the ongoing cost of living crisis in the UK. And these financial pressures have led senior management to consider demutualisation of the company to attract external investment. So this prospect of diluting the employee-owned structure, understandably, has created a sense of unease among the workforce and also the wider employee ownership sector in the UK about how these changes would unfold and how it would impact the model. So what's happened in recent years is the business has shifted away from a cooperative ethos, really, more towards privileging managerial interests. But there has been some collective mobilisation, and we can observe some pushback, which has been well documented. So if we look at some of the constraints in our report, what I guess is important to emphasise here is that John Lewis's workforce appears to be fighting back by embracing internal activism. So where employees are taking a more active role in shaping the company's policies and practices. And since the announcement relatively recently to change the ownership structure, workers have since exercised their right to voice their opinions and hold leadership accountable. So the chair of the John Lewis Partnership, Dame Sharon White, has now ruled out selling an equity stake to external investors before her term ends in February 2025. So we'll see what will happen. But what this has done is direct focus once again on to the fundamental problem that mutuals and cooperative organisations often face in raising investment capital when compared to their competitors. And the UK currently lags behind other countries who are introducing new legislation, usually in the form of mutual capital instruments, which are a new way of issuing shares only available to mutual organisations in order to raise investment capital. And these offer more sustainable opportunities for all companies with a mutual constitution. So some examples there from democratising the workplace, and I'll hand over to Andy now to consider democratising public services.
Thanks, Karen. How am I doing for time?
19, here we are.
Oh, a minute left. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So. Yeah, in this sort of section of the report and this theme, we've really focused upon what's the trend that's become known as remunicipalisation, which doesn't get any easier to say the number of times I say it. But this is a really, really important trend around the world to push back against privatisation and the broader neoliberalism of public services and economic governance that's taken off really in the last 20 years, to the extent that now I think there's something like 1,700 cases around the world of cities, towns and regions that have remunicipalised, taken back into forms of public ownership and control, services, infrastructures, assets that were formerly outsourced. And Europe has been at the centre of this movement. We've been carrying out another project, which Anna mentioned before, funded by the European Research Council, which has been cataloguing the remunicipalisation phenomenon. And Europe is the epicentre of this. It's about 60% of the cases that we've catalogued have been in Europe, predominantly in the water and energy sectors, but there's a whole plethora of local government sectors where we've seen this trend happening. What I find very fascinating about this trend is it's hardly ever mentioned in mainstream policy debate. It's kind of ignored. Although the UN, interestingly, has now begun to pick up on it as a key trend, particularly in the wake of the pandemic, when integrated local, publicly owned and controlled service delivery, people are beginning to realise, well, actually, this is quite important. Just briefly to talk about it, the trend's really prompted by a dissatisfaction with the failings of outsourcing and privatisation. In the UK, we like to say we've had 40 years of the experiment. So if anybody wants to come and see that it doesn't work, you just come and look at the UK. But I think what's critical is it's a key pushback against a significant element of the neoliberal approach to economic governance that's dominated. And what we find with privatisation is not only does it almost universally increase costs, but it doesn't deliver on the promises of better quality public services. It actually makes public services worse. It degrades working conditions in most cases. The promised modernisation and influx of innovative private sector management, there's very little evidence that happens, of course. And the bottom line is often poorer quality public services and actually more unequal public service provision. So not surprisingly, there's a massive pushback against this, and it's quite heartening to see the trend. A lot of the places that deprivatise do it in a very pragmatic way. The privatisation didn't work, so they take things back into public ownership and control with very little fuss. And it's often interestingly the same centre-right or centre-left politicians that privatise things in the first place. It's the same parties that then take things back into public ownership quietly when they fail. But the other side to this, which I find really heartening, is the kind of bottom-up grassroots campaigns for taking these services back. And in our report, we highlight a few of these, and I'm not going to say too much about these, partly because of time constraints, but also because particularly the Paris and the Hamburg cases are going to be covered later, I think, by the speakers. But I would just focus very briefly on one case, which is the Berlin case, which is really fascinating from the point of view of transformative change and democratic processes, I think. Now, Berlin, as many of you may know, Berlin has had quite an active campaign recently to take the privatised housing stock back into public control. Since German unification, much of the city's housing stock was privatised, and it's been part of a broader gentrification programme and market-led development. To the extent that the city now faces, like many cities around the world, faces a housing crisis, both in terms of housing availability, but also basic affordability for the average person who's not part of an elite group, ordinary citizens. So, like many places, the ordinary citizens are being priced out of the property sector altogether. Much of the privatised housing in Berlin is in the hands of a few large developers who often own an individual developer can own hundreds of thousands of properties. And this has led to spiralling rents over the last 20 to 30 years. And this has sustained a new campaign, a grassroots movement of tenants groups, activists, academics and others to take large areas of the private housing stock back into public ownership and control. And around this, a new campaign called Deutsche Wohnen Enteignen formed, which those of you who know your German will know that means socialized DW. Deutsche Wohnen is one of the probably the biggest, largest private property and owner of privatized apartments in the city. So the whole campaign was a real focus to sort of appropriate, in an old-fashioned sense, perhaps appropriate ownership. The campaign faced the combined forces of the city elites and the business establishment. Most of the main political parties were against the proposal. Even some of the trade unions were still in favour of private development against the demands for more democratic public housing. But the campaign won, and crucially, what it did is it used the ability that German cities have to run direct democracy campaigns through laws that allow referenda to be held on a particular issue. If a campaign can gather enough signatures, then a referendum can be held, and a referendum was held on the housing question in September 2021. It passed with almost 60% of the vote, but crucially it wasn't upheld because it wasn't a binding vote, and the city now has another campaign to fight another referendum which will be binding and force the city council to appropriate hundreds of thousands of private dwellings. And this is really quite a radical proposal. A few things I'd point to here that I think are critical in thinking about democratization processes. Firstly, the movement was very non-hierarchical and didn't have a formal organizational backing behind it. It came out of anarchist and autonomous left traditions. But I think critically, it was linked to a much deeper, broader historical tradition of civil society activism in Berlin. Referendums have been held on other issues in the last 20 to 30 years around water, successful referendums on water deprivatization, energy deprivatization, and also around the plans by private developers to develop the former Tempelhof airport into a set of gentrified spaces. Well, those were all referendums that were won. They were all referenda that interestingly brought together different groups that came together to crystallized. So I think what you can see in Berlin is not one particular movement or struggle or set of actors that drive things associated with particular organizations, but an ability for civil society itself to mobilize at key moments to push politicians in particular directions. Okay, can we move to the last slide? Yeah, I've got it. Yeah, okay. Yep. So just to finish, a few critical reflections on all this and where it all goes. Now, I think the range of cases that we've got in the report and elsewhere, they demonstrate in many ways, in a more heartening way, that economic democracy is live and well, and it's being campaigned for across Europe. As Bob said, we've chosen to focus on a few things. We could have talked about broader issues like basic income and so on, and those are very live debates as well. But I think to close, I'd make the following points in thinking about how economic democracy can be made possible and how we contribute to a broader progressive agenda. The first point, I think, which is critical, is that the evidence from a lot of our work suggests that genuine struggles for economic democracy can succeed, and they can help to tackle broader social and economic injustices. The example of Paris, which we'll hear about later, is very important in that regard, with regard to the water sector, but also the example of Hamburg, where a remunicipalization of the energy network has allowed the city to have a much more ambitious plan to speed up the transition away from fossil fuels. Secondly, the evidence that we've come across and other researchers have pointed out is that economic democracy is very uneven across Europe. And I think the reasons for that is links to what Bob was saying about the institutional legal supports. You find it stronger in Northern Europe, in Germany in particular, where there are federal, the federal state allows local actors actually a lot of leverage to actually affect progressive change. But you also find it in Scandinavia, where there still is that strong tradition of social democracy, co-determination, but also you have relatively decentralized governance structures that allow local actors to do interesting things. Economic democracy is far weaker in more centralized states like the UK or in much of southern Eastern Europe, where just isn't the capacity locally or nationally to really push back against a broader neoliberal agenda at EU level. But I think we also have to emphasize the real problems of a continued role of neoliberal economic governance at different scales across Europe, which frustrates a lot of genuine attempts to move towards economic democracy. You've only got to look at Germany and the Schuldenbremse, this break on the coalition doing anything really progressive around climate change to see how damaging some of these neoliberal tropes are. So I think another problem I think you often find is that, if I move to the next slide. Yeah, I want to finish then and talk about some of the constraints really that are there to finish off. So I think the first thing I'd say is that the difficulties really are breaking through elite knowledge structures and networks that claim often have a monopoly of the policy arena and not to be open to democratic alternatives. And as I say, this happens at all scales across Europe. There's an unwillingness in particular of expert and elite groups to accept other forms of knowledge and experience. Our research, for example, in the Citizens Economic Council in the UK found a real disdain amongst mainstream economists for the idea that other kind of actors might have economic knowledge and perspectives that might question some of their mainstream economic framing. But I think we also have positive examples from Paris and Hamburg, again, which we'll hear about later, where elite views, small c conservatism is challenged and can be overcome if there is a determined local leadership. Another problem I think that we often find with our research is the fatigue of activists and citizen participations beyond key mobilizing moments. And I think a key issue here is how we sustain democratic breakthroughs. How do we create infrastructures, regulations, legislation that can really enable a longer term project of economic democracy? Because we celebrate small victories, but often those can fall by the wayside. And I think one of the problems there is that you have a very powerful entrenched elite, whether it's a conservative elite of state officials or government actors who don't want to do things in a different way and are very wedded to a status quo, or it's vested corporate interests that are very powerful and have resources and deep pockets to be able to frustrate things in the longer term. And I think the final thing I'd end up with, particularly as this is an audience, I'm assuming, of a fairly centre-left, social democratic, kind of progressive nature, decent people, we like to think of ourselves. But I do think that there's a sense that too many people, particularly in Europe, still believe in a kind of post-1945 model of social partnership, social democracy. And I'm not saying we all have to become die-hard anarchists or old-fashioned Marxists, but I think we need to question some of that old attachment to the idea that if we can restore a partnership with employers, all will be well. Because I think for us, fundamentally, economic democracy is challenging the private domination, and when we talk by private, we're really talking about corporate domination of elite interest over ownership and control of decision-making and wealth in the economy. For me, those two things go together, and that's where our agenda has to build from today. Thank you very much. So we just acknowledge quickly all the people that have helped us in this project.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Karim and Bob. We now move to the comments part from our two commentators, and later we will have also Q&A, so you prepare your questions. So now is Thomas Marois. Please, you have around 7 minutes for your comments.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. I'm glad it worked out. It's like being invited or to walk into a French patisserie and pick everything you want. This conference is exactly the kind of topic, economic democracy, that I just love to spend time on, and there's so much that we could draw on. For my comment, I want to think a little bit about, in terms of the report and some of the ideas that I can't help it, the Adam Smith School of Business has brought to the table, ironically, this sort of sneaker cell within the business school around questions of theories of change. And I'm coming to this from a scholar of public banks, which makes it into the report as a potential form of economic democracy. But really this notion that we have to think about power if we're going to think about economic democracy, and the necessity to challenge and change entrenched power structures, institutions, and ideas, and that we need a way to think about that. And some of the ideas brought up in the report include that of put in different ways, I think, but getting champions on board, both within governments and within corporations, and finding those champions who are willing to rethink the way that society, institutions, organizations are constructed, run, and decisions made. And really this sort of important notion of a more bottom-up approach to governance, and that's that sort of reclaiming of our voices as a means of reclaiming citizenship and disillusionment and all those things that have been stripped away from us over the last 40 years or so. And so I want to speak just, there's not a lot of time, but I do want to speak a little bit to this question of finance and democratization of public banks, because this is one of those areas where you think, banking and finance are the least accessible, one of the least open, areas of democratization. And yet, to speak of the democratization of water in Berlin, it went through a public bank. To speak about, the democratization or the reclaiming or re-municipalization of public services, it requires financing. And partly also to connect back to what Karim was saying earlier about the necessity of the, Europe and the global South, to highlight that there are lessons in the global South. We can learn from democratization in the global South to inform the global North. It's not as if the global North has sort of, all the lessons already learned and they just haven't, been shared enough. There are ways we should be sharing back and forth between global North and global South. And this brings me to the topic then of public banks. And just quickly, those who may or may not be familiar, but there are more than 900 public banks still in the world. They control assets in excess of $57 trillion. That's up from $49 trillion 3 years ago. Put that in context, that's 20% greater than the GDP of the US, Germany, China, Japan, and India combined. Absolutely massive. These are already owned, already existing institutions in every single corner of the earth. They have many forms of ownership and governance, and yet we know very, very little about them. But these institutions are really a foundational entity that can support this, change. And in fact, they have to be the ones that will be, supportive of this idea of economic democratization. They are the ones that can, banks, but public banks are the ones that can grant credit or withhold credit. You can talk about conditionalities, but conditionalities that are supportive of economic democratization, of the greening of public enterprises. If you want a loan, hey, guess what? We're happy to give it to you. We're happy to give it to you on concessional terms, but we want you to guarantee workers' rights. We want you to think about the means by which you're going to make decisions in your organization and the way by which you're going to green your organization. Are you going to build in, progressive mandates and laws around gender equity and these sorts of things? And it's an extremely powerful tool that we can use for a theory of change. Is this the use of money that is already our money? These are resources held by individuals, by communities, by governments, by political authorities within public banks that are already owned and controlled by the public. Yet we're not exercising control. In some cases we are. And there are examples of really interesting, always imperfect examples of economic democracy. The Banco Popular in Costa Rica, the world's most democratic bank, has a workers' assembly of 290 members that then elects a national board. We can look at something like the KfW in Germany, has a very broad-based governing supervisory council, including workers' assemblies, trade unions, and so on. But so does India. So do many Nordic banks. So do banks in Japan. So do banks in North Africa. It's all around the world, right? These are not radical, new, crazy ideas, but relatively, sort of unexplored. So, this really goes to this question of a theory of change, because the notions that we begin at home, in a sense, and these banks exist within your countries, exist within your communities, and you can begin to exercise some sort of, begin discussing and entering into, negotiations with public banks and those authorities that own them to begin democratizing those entities. And it's important because this is a systematic approach to this question of economic democracy. We're hoping to put on the agenda for the next Financing for Development conference in Madrid in 2025 a notion of commanding those public development banks and national development banks that are within your countries and societies to begin fostering a global public development bank ecosystem by which we align the multilaterals with the nationals, with subnational development banks to begin putting forward notions of green and just economic development, to begin aligning this $57 trillion in assets and putting them in the service of green public services, municipal regeneration, and so on. So, those who have the ears of some of your national authorities, we need the support in terms of moving forward in the UN system to put this on the agenda. But the idea is really about, creating a powerful global ecosystem by which we can begin to change those public services and economic services at the local level, and using public money by which to say, if we're going to lend to you, let's hold those assets within our community, let's green those assets, let's make those assets gender equitable. And just to sort of wrap up then, with that notion of the importance of building on financial democracy as a powerful lever. Just to, one of the comments on the report, I would like to see a little more comment on how because let me back up for a second, why I'm so interested in public banks and the promotion of them and being critical of them, but saying this is a potential alternative, is because, in a sense, you sidestep this 40 years of critique that we've been saying finance is bad, financialization is bad, let's go after the big guys, and we critique and critique and critique, and we've gone nowhere. And so the purpose now is that we've already have these assets. Let's just go around. We don't need to even bother with private finance in many regards. We've got our own. Let's use them. And let's stop wasting energies, because they're not going to do anything. GFANZ has collapsed, in a sense, right, around green transitions and so on. But we have these assets. So I think that same notion of a theory of change applies to sort of local economic development, public services, municipal services. So you've got these assets already. Let's democratize them. Let's just go around. Let's just build, an economic and democratized system through those people, assets, institutions that we already have. Thank you.
Now the floor is for Martin, please.
Off. So that's better. So thanks very much to Anna for the invitation. I think it's especially important for a group like FEPS, because what I'm going to suggest in these remarks really is that this agenda of economic democracy really provides a kind of key and an approach for social democracy in Europe to think about how to renew itself for the context of the 2020s and 2030s. It really opens up a kind of broader agenda that I think is going to be very promising for thinking about what it would be to have a renewed and re-energized form of social democracy. So I'm very sympathetic to the argument and the approach in the paper and that we've heard here. today. I think there's a tendency often for progressives and for people on the left to look for the one big idea that's going to kind of be the sort of going to unlock problems of inequality and social injustice. So if you think of a lot of the if you think a lot about the enthusiasm for universal basic income, that sometimes has that kind of feature. Economic democracy, as we've seen today, it's a much more complicated idea. It doesn't have the law of simplicity that UBI does. It's really an invitation to think about an institutional architecture, to think about an ecosystem of institutions and how they might fit together. So it doesn't have the kind of magic bullet element that UBI does. But nevertheless, I think the world is a complex place and we shouldn't worry about the complexity of these sorts of solutions. And I think, you know, that it's appropriate to have that kind of more nuanced approach. It's also, and I think this is brought out really in some of what we've heard about the challenges and the institutional constraints and the problems of this kind of approach. It really is just about starting about where one is in different contexts at different levels, from the city level right up to the European level, thinking about improvements and institutional innovations from where you are. So it's a very realistic, and we've heard that really in Thomas's remarks as well, thinking about the kinds of institutions that we've already got and the kinds of capacities that they have to be deployed to create more equal and more democratic economies. So, I mean, what I really want to do today, I'm a political philosopher, so I want to talk about this, if that's okay, by stepping back a little bit and talking about this in terms of ideas and talking about the kind of fundamental values that are at stake with this kind of approach. And what I really want to argue, as I sort of suggested at the outset, that the approach that we see outlined in this paper really gives a way to renew social democracy, to kind of really re-energize that tradition in a way that really takes seriously the two core elements of the social democratic tradition. It takes very seriously the value of the social and the value of social equality and the value of democracy, and tries to think in an imaginative way about how you realize that in practice. So with regard to that idea of the social and ideas of social equality, we live obviously in a world of horrific, troubling levels of inequality, where what we're worried about there isn't just a worry about distributive questions. It's not just about income and wealth, but it's also about inequalities of voice and power and control. So the kind of approaches to economic democracy that we've heard about this morning are about finding more points in an economic structure in which power, voice and control can be brought down and then to more citizens, and that more citizens can actually experience and deploy that kind of power and voice and control in their economic lives. So within political philosophy, there's probably been a shift over the last 20 to 30 years in thinking about egalitarianism, in thinking about ideas of equality, a shift away really from just thinking about distributive patterns to more thinking about patterns of social relations, thinking about ideas of social equality that are captured by ideas of equal standing and status, by people actually being able to relate to one another as equals. And I think with all the different kinds of institutional elements that we've heard about this morning, what we have there are descriptions of different ways of creating economic structures, relationships, institutions, in which citizens actually meet each other more on the same level, with less hierarchy, with more distribution of voice, and with more sense of all actually being engaged in a shared enterprise. Despite my accent, I'm still an EU citizen, as an Irish passport holder, but as you all know, in the Brexit referendum in the country where I live, and where I'm also a citizen, there was an enormous power to that idea of taking back control, right? That cut through in an extraordinary way to people, because people had a sense that they lacked that control, right? And even, you know, arguments were made, you may be worse off for a while, but it's worth it to get your your dignity, your sense of control in the economic domain back again. Now, I'm not defending those arguments, but I think we on the left need to take incredibly serious the resonance of those arguments and the way that they cut through to people. And if we're serious about trying to have a progressive agenda that gives real answers and responses to the law of the hard right than having an economic program that actually does devolve power and control and voice to people is, I think, the way forward. So I talked there about that, the idea of the social and the idea of social equality that's there, and the idea of economic democracy. I think the appeal to democracy here is equally important. So writing in 1848, this is over 175 years ago, in the Principles of Political Economy, John Stuart Mill talked about the way that you couldn't expect to have a mass participation democratic society unless you also had the exercise of democratic rights in the workplace. He thought it was just a prospect for a dysfunctional form of political democracy in the long run unless you also brought democracy into the economic sphere. And I think those arguments that are 175 years old still apply very powerful today, and they're exactly what we see in the work that we've heard about this morning. So I think there's three kinds of democratic arguments for this shift towards the economic democracy agenda. A more democratic economic sphere creates more problem-solving capacity because it makes use of more of the know-how, the tacit knowledge, the expertise that's already embedded there in the economy. It's more likely to lead to more just outcomes because that devolvement of power is going to change the way that those sorts of institutions operate. But also, as John Stuart Mill argued, it's a precondition for the kind of creation of the kind of democratic confidence, the kind of democratic hope and capacities, the democratic publics as well, that the authors have talked about this morning, that are then a precondition to having a well-functioning political domain. So I think that idea of social equality and that idea of an extended, radicalized, more ambitious form of democracy, they're in deep interconnection with each other. They buttress each other and they're mutually supportive. And what that looks like, if you want to then move from that more abstract idea of thinking about values to thinking about the institutional realization of that, what that looks like in practice is exactly the range of institutions and policies that we've heard about this morning. So,
Martin, sorry, can you wrap up, please? Thanks, everyone from the panel. Now we open for questions. We are running a little bit over time, but we will do a round of questions. So yes, and for questions you can remain seated because then the camera catches you. If you stand, you will be out of camera. Yes, please, we can start. Introduce yourself, please.
Okay. Sergei Kasyanov, Harvard Alumni Club. What is your take on general democratic development and destiny of Europe democracy with regards to both internal factors, like you described, the lack of deliberation and engagement of broader publics, fatigue and lack of resources among civil society activists, results of recent elections we know, and external factors as a full-scale hot war when authoritarian and totalitarian axis attacked Europe's eastern flank. What do you think of the future of the democracy in Europe? Thank you.
Who else wants to ask questions? We collect several and then we do a round for all together. Yes, please.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry.
Okay. Hello, Matic Primts from Organization for Participatory Society. I'd like to have a question about something that I found missing in the report. And, you know, we can see that there are all these kinds of economic democratic projects, processes springing up in various places. But I think there's one that's missing, and I wonder, and I'm talking about like democratic media experiments or media run, and I can't name one, and I wonder if you considered some and how you found them, you know, fall short of this aspiration, and maybe if you have ideas how the aspiration could be met.
Thank you, Matthew. I have two questions, actually. One is about question of scale, in the sense that do you have cases of big, let's say, companies or companies where there is a big output where this kind of economic democracy models have been implemented? Because the question of also the scalability in general of also these experiments is quite important. And the second one is what kind of regulatory environment also, for instance, at the European level, could help in fostering economic democracy. And I guess this goes more into a more general question on the link between economic democracy and also the concept of social economy. Thank you.
There are no urgent other questions. We then do discussion because many things will still be discussed later today. So I would suggest that the speakers pick up the questions that they prefer to answer.
Okay.
Also commenting on the comments.
Yeah, okay. A brief comment on the comments, most of which I agree with, and I think the one I would really take on board to emphasise is starting off with what exists locally, nationally, in terms of building out these alternatives. And I think, as Thomas and Martin both pointed out, there's a lot of existing assets and infrastructures and things that we can build on and make more democratic. But I would actually add a bit of a caveat there. If you look at some of the work we've been doing around remunicipalisation, one of the big problems with deprivatisation as it's happened in the last 40, 50 years, and also, I mean, again, the UK is the experiment par excellence here, is the outsourcing of so many services, activities, infrastructures, assets, whatever. One of the detrimental effects of that is that we've lost in the UK in particular, but I think we also see this in Germany where we've had austerity and cutbacks and so on. We've lost a lot of skills and knowledge about how to run things alternatively, how to run public assets in the common good as opposed to for narrow commercial reasons. And I think one of the big issues that a lot of cities find when they bring things back into public ownership is actually all the capacity and knowledge that was there in the past is gone. So I think there's a real job there of, and I did some really interesting interviews with some people in Edinburgh recently, both trade unions and the people running the Edinburgh City Council, and they were saying, well, 40 years ago they had local public integrated capacity to deal with all kinds of problems, you know, whether it's housing, whether it's a health emergency, whether it's transport, and so on. One of the effects of neoliberalism, neoliberal governance, is a lot of that is gone. A lot of that knowledge capacity is gone. So I think it's also a project of building up our knowledge, skills, expertise around all these different areas. So that's the first thing I would say. I think that's my broad comment to the comments. In terms of these questions, and I'll just deal with a couple, and I'll let the ones I think I can answer, and I'll let Bob and Karen deal with the difficult ones. The general democratic deficit question. I mean that's a big question, probably much bigger than we can answer today. But I do think one of the problems in Europe in the last 40, 50 years is we've had a kind of notional democratic project that hasn't been anything of the sort. It's been you know, with the shift toward neoliberal governance, with all the impositions through the single market program, with austerity rules, with the whole Maastricht fiscal agenda. We've actually seen a project that calls itself democratic, but it has actually been it's been quite authoritarian for some time. But it's been a sort of soft centrist authoritarianism. So I think and I think Martin's point about one of the things that came out of Brexit was this notion that people don't feel in control. It's taking back control of things. So I think if you're going to renew democracy in Europe, you really need to wake up and smell the coffee that actually the democracy we have is not good enough. So let's not defend a kind of version of liberal democracy that leaves too many realms of important public life left to elite and corporate groups to run, particularly around economic areas, but also we see in social policy. Too many areas of social policy now are basically run on commercial basis to make profits rather than the common good. So I think we need to extend our view of what democracy is, and that's a difficult argument to make, but I think it will resonate if we can get the key people making those arguments. Just on the media stuff, that's a really important point, and I don't have an easy answer. But when you look at institutions like the BBC, and this goes back to the point about the assets we already have, the BBC, for example, is one of those great public assets, but it's been run as a commercial, financialised. With a commercialised set of values and narratives for about 40 years. It was a far more interesting democratic space in the 1970s. In the 1980s, before, of course, Thatcher and subsequent governments completely kind of removed any sense of democracy and debate and deliberation from the BBC. So it's reclaiming those public state media assets, but also it's obviously a set of agendas around legislating for a diversely owned set of private media as well. I think I'll let other people have a say on some of these, the hard scale question and other things as well. But
I would ask. Thank you. Very short, yeah, because we need to close. So you just select some items, yeah.
Well, thank you very much for all the questions, and thank you again for your comments. They were absolutely excellent, and I think they've certainly given us food for thought. In terms of scale and regulatory environment, these are really, really important questions. And we've spoken about bottom-up, but there's also a top-down element to this, in that obviously the regulatory environment can be a facilitator to greater democracy. I think it's just a case of perhaps emphasising human rights here at the regulatory level in terms of the EU. And I think pursuing a human rights narrative is quite important, in that arguably one of the issues over the neoliberal era is, or the last 40 years, is that the notion of the individual has been commandeered by a particular political stance. And I think it's about recapturing the notion of individual rights, the freedom to do things. And I think campaigning on that sort of basis may well be a means of, to invoke the theory of change, perhaps, amending the regulatory environment in that respect. In terms of questions of scale, I think in the report we do adhere or address elements of differential scale. For example, in the initiative, the Economic Democracy Initiative in Slovenia, they're always dealing with questions of scale and trying to offer their services to the Slovenian government and appeal to the European Commission. There are obvious constraints in terms of the politics of it. So I think perhaps small gains, incremental gains, may well be better than nothing in that respect. Is that okay?
Sure, thanks. I mean, just in terms of scale, like on the question of public banks, just to have an idea of the realm of the possible. You can look at a democratic bank like KfW, national, in fact, international level, over 630 billion euros in assets, absolutely massive. You can look at a worker-owned or trade union-controlled bank in Japan, Rokin banks, over $360 billion in assets, but also small-scale ones. The Banco Popular in Costa Rica has around 6 billion in assets, but that means it's also the third largest bank in the country. Or you can look at a city-level bank like the Banco Ciudad de Buenos Aires, which has about 5 billion in assets, but it's over 130 years old. So it's at all scales, and from small scale, if you want to call 5 billion small, up to 630 billion euros or larger. So it's really everywhere.
We'll have to answer questions because also we have a long day and we actually will address the regulatory environment, for example, in our policy panel, I think. So this question will be answered during the day. So I want to thank the panel participants very much for their inputs, for your insights, and we stay around, of course, and discuss further this topic. And now we have a small break for 15 minutes. There is coffee and snacks outside, and I would ask us to be back by around 11:05. So